There is a valley in western Massachusetts where a river runs 3 miles down a narrow cut between the hills. In the spring of 1874, 4 villages stood along that river: Williamsburg, Skinnerville, Haydenville, Leeds. Between them, they held mills for silk and brass and buttons, 1,000 jobs, and the homes of the families who worked them. The river turned every wheel in the valley. It was the reason the villages existed, and the people who lived there knew it the way you know a thing you see every day, which is to say, they mostly did not think about it at all. 3 miles above the first village, in a fold of the hills, sat a reservoir holding 600 million gallons of water. The dam that held it back was earth and stone, 43 feet high, built 8 years earlier by the men who owned the mills. It was supposed to cost more than it cost. The difference between what it should have been and what it was had been decided in meetings, on paper, by men who lived on high ground. One man lived below the dam. His name was George Cheney. He kept the gate, read the water, and wrote the numbers down in a book. Every night he fell asleep to the sound of water moving through the waste pipe. And after enough years, the sound became like a clock in the house, a thing you only truly hear on the day it changes. On the morning of May 16th, 1874, it changed. What happened in the next hour would kill 139 people, sweep 4 villages off the map, their neighbors carried in their heads, and become, for 15 years, the worst dam disaster in the history of the United States. Then another dam broke at Johnstown, and the country moved its memory there, and the Mill River Valley was left to remember itself. This is what that morning felt like, from the inside. George Cheney could tell you the level of the reservoir without getting out of bed. He had not planned to learn this. It had come to him the way most of what he knew had come to him, through repetition, through living for years inside the sound of a thing, until the sound and his understanding of it were the same. The waste pipe ran under the dam and carried the overflow down toward the river, and the water moving through it made a low, steady rush that reached the gatehouse where he lived with his wife Elizabeth, their children, and his mother and father. When the reservoir was low, the sound thinned out, went higher, took on a hiss. When the reservoir was full, the sound dropped into something deeper, rounder, a note he could feel in the floorboards if he stood still on a quiet night. In the 3rd week of April, 1874, the note was as deep as he had ever heard it. He got up at 5, as he did every morning, and dressed in the dark so as not to wake Elizabeth. The stove in the kitchen had held its coals overnight, and he built the fire up and put the kettle on and went out into the gray before sunrise to walk the dam. This was the job. Other men in the valley tended looms or lathes or drove teams. George Cheney tended a wall of earth 600 feet long and 43 feet high, and behind it, 100 acres of impounded water that belonged to the mill owners 3 miles downstream. He opened the gate when the mills needed water and closed it when they did not. He read the height of the water off a marked post and wrote it in a book the company gave him. And every morning, before breakfast, he walked the length of the dam and looked at what the night had done to it. The walk took 11 minutes if nothing stopped him. Something always stopped him at the same place. Near the base of the dam, on the downstream side, water came out of the ground. It was a small flow, clear, steady, no wider than a man's hand. It had been there for years. He had shown it to the mill owners more than once, and the mill owners had looked at it, and conferred with each other, and concluded what they always concluded, which was that all earthen dams weep a little, and that clear water was nothing to worry about, because clear water meant the flow was not carrying the dam along with it. This was true, as far as it went. Cheney knew it was true. He also knew that he was the only man in the conversation who would be sleeping under the dam that night, and that the men explaining seepage to him would be sleeping in Williamsburg and Haydenville and Northampton, in good houses, on high ground. He crouched at the leak that April morning the way he crouched at it every morning. He looked at the water. It was clear. He put 2 fingers in the flow and held them there and felt the cold of it. Water that had been sitting against the base of the dam all winter, coming through by a path nobody had ever seen and nobody could see, because the path ran through 40 feet of packed earth, and there was no way to look inside a dam. You could only read its surface. The way you read a man's face and guessed at the rest of him. The flow was the same as yesterday. He stood up and finished the walk. At the crest he stopped and looked at the reservoir. April had been wet. Snowmelt had come down off the hills through March, and then the rains had come behind the melt, and the water stood higher against the marked post than he had seen it stand in his years at the gate. It was a fine sight if you did not think about it too long. 100 acres of gray water lying flat and quiet in the fold of the hills. Mist on it in the early light. The shoreline trees standing in water, partway up their trunks. 600 million gallons. He had heard an engineer say the figure once, and it had stayed with him, though he had no way to picture a number like that. What he could picture was simpler. Everything below him for 3 miles. Every house, every mill, every bridge, every person he knew by name was below that waterline. The whole valley lived at the bottom of a hill, and at the top of the hill, somebody had built a lake. He went in to breakfast. Elizabeth had the children at the table, and his father was in the chair by the stove. And the kitchen smelled of wood smoke and oatmeal, and the wet wool of coats drying on their pegs. Through the window, over the shoulder of the hill, the sun was coming up on the valley. From the gatehouse you could not see the villages. You could see the notch where the river left the hills. And in winter, when the trees were bare, you could see a church spire in Williamsburg. 3 miles off, small as a nail, his father asked about the water. His father asked every morning. The old man had spent his working life around mill dams, small ones, the kind that failed sometimes and flooded a meadow and drowned some hens. And he had never fully made his peace with the size of the thing his son was keeping. "Hi," George said. "Highest I've had it." His father looked at him for a moment, and then looked at the stove. "Rain coming again this week," his father said. "I know it." After breakfast, George went to the small desk where he kept the company book and entered the morning's reading. The book was plain. Board covers, ruled pages, and the company asked only for dates and water heights and the times the gate was opened and closed. For years, that was all he had written in it. Sometime in the past year, he had started adding lines of his own. He could not have said exactly when it began or why. A note about the leak, a note about the rain, a note about a soft place in the earth near the east end that firmed up in summer and went spongy again every spring. Nobody had asked him for these notes. Nobody read this book but him, and once a year, a clerk in an office in Northampton who copied out the water heights and ignored the rest. He wrote the height, then, below it, in the smaller hand, he used for the lines that were his own. He wrote that the seep at the base was unchanged, that the water stood 2 feet below the crest, and that more rain was expected before Sunday. He looked at what he had written, 2 feet below the crest, on a dam 43 feet high, holding back 100 acres of spring water. 2 feet was the margin. That was the whole distance between the valley as it was and the valley as it could become. He had said this once, in almost these words, to one of the mill owners, on the crest of the dam. On a summer afternoon 2 years back, the mill owner had listened with his hands behind his back and then said the dam had stood 8 years and would stand 80 more, and that Cheney kept it admirably. And then he had gotten into his buggy and driven back down into the valley where the water was not. George closed the book. Outside, the sound of the waste pipe ran on under everything, deep and round and full, the note of a reservoir with no room left in it. His children heard it and heard nothing, the way children raised beside the ocean hear nothing in the surf. Elizabeth heard it and knew it was loud this spring, because she was married to the man who kept it, and she had learned some of his ears. George Cheney heard it all day, the way you hear your own heart when the doctor has told you to start paying attention to it. That night, the rain came back, and the sound got deeper, and he lay in the dark beside his wife and listened to the water leaving the reservoir at the greatest rate the pipe could carry, and knew that it was not enough, and that the water standing behind the wall above his house was rising while he lay there. An inch, another inch, in the dark, in the rain, 3 miles uphill from 10,000 sleeping people who had never once heard the sound that he could not stop hearing. In the morning he wrote the new height in the book, 18 inches below the crest. To understand what stood in the water's path, you had to walk it, and the best time to walk it was a working morning, when the valley was doing what the valley did, start at the dam and go down. The river left the reservoir through Cheney's gate and dropped into a wooded ravine, narrow, steep-sided, the water loud on the stone. For the first mile there was nothing but the road and the trees and the river braiding itself down the grade. Then the ravine opened. The hills stepped back, and the first roofs of Williamsburg came up out of the valley floor. Williamsburg was the oldest of the 4 villages and the highest on the river. It had the look of a town that had grown a piece at a time. White houses along the main street, a church with a spire you could see from the hills, a grist mill, a woolen mill, shops, a post office where the stage stopped. On a Saturday morning, the street had wagons on it by 7. Farmers came down out of the hill towns with butter and eggs. The blacksmith's fire was lit before the church bell rang the hour. Something over 700 people lived in and around the village, and the river ran through the middle of them. Crossed by wooden bridges that children walked over on their way to school without looking down. Below Williamsburg, the valley narrowed again, and the river picked up speed, and after a mile, it reached a place that had not existed 30 years earlier. Skinnerville was one man's idea. William Skinner had come from London as a young man with a trade in silk dyeing and not much else. And he had built on the Mill River a silk mill that made some of the finest thread in America. And around the mill, he had built a village. He built houses for his workers and rented them fair. He built a boarding house for the unmarried girls who tended the spinning frames. He built his own house, a big one, with gardens, close enough to the mill that he could see it from his windows. Close to 200 people lived in Skinnerville, and nearly every one of them, one way or another, ate from the silk. The mill bell told them when to wake, when to eat, and when to quit. On still mornings, you could hear the frames running from the road, a sound like rain that never let up, and the people who lived there did not hear it at all. The river that turned Skinner's wheel had a value you could put in dollars, and Skinner had. He was one of the proprietors of the Reservoir Company. So were the Haydens, downstream, and the men who ran the silk in Leeds. The dam in the hills was theirs. They had built it because the river ran thin in a dry August, and a thin river meant stopped wheels, and stopped wheels meant silent mills, and idle hands and contracts unmet. The reservoir was insurance. It was water in the bank. Below Skinnerville, the valley pinched tighter, and the river dropped harder, and the sound of it changed from rain to work. Haydenville was brass. The Hayden brothers had built works there that made cocks and valves and plumbers' fittings, and the name Haydenville was stamped into brass fixtures in buildings from Boston to San Francisco. The brass works was the biggest thing in the valley. Brick, 3 stories, long as a city block, and around it had grown a true factory village, tenements and boarding houses, a company store, a school, a church, close to 1,000 people. The men went in at the bell, and the heat of the casting floor met them at the door. Boys of 14 worked the finishing rooms. The Hayden family lived above it all in a stone house on the hill, and Joel Hayden had been lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. And when people in the valley said the name Hayden, they said it the way you say the name of the weather. Past Haydenville, the river had one more village to serve. Leeds sat where the valley began to open toward the plain, the last narrow place before the river spread out and calmed down. Leeds made buttons and silk. The button work stood right over the water. And upstairs, at the long benches, sat rows of young women, many of them new to the country, Irish girls and French-Canadian girls, sorting and finishing buttons through a 10-hour day. 60 cents. The Nonotuck silk mill ran across the river from it. Perhaps 800 people lived in Leeds, in houses that crowded the banks, the way houses do in a mill village, because the mill was the reason for everything, and nobody wanted to walk far in a New England winter. Below Leeds lay Florence, and then Northampton, and the wide meadows of the Connecticut River. But there, the valley's grip loosened, and the story changed. And this story belongs to the narrow mile. Walk them again, quickly, the way the water would. 3 miles, 4 villages, 2 church spires, 5 mills, a dozen bridges, a school in each village, something like 2,500 people living inside the sound of the river, and hundreds more up in the hills who came down to it to trade. Every mill wheel, every paycheck, every rented house, every marriage between a spinner and a brass finisher. Every child who knew the river as the thing you fished in June and skated in January. All of it ran on the water that came down from the hills. The valley trusted the river, because the river had made the valley. The dam was part of the river now. 8 years old. Out of sight in the high woods. Owned by the same men whose names were on the mills and the paychecks and the villages themselves. Trusting the dam was not a decision anyone made. It was simpler than that. You cannot walk to work every morning of your life across a thing you believe might kill you, so you believe otherwise. And after a while, the believing stops being belief and becomes the shape of an ordinary day. On a Saturday morning in May, an ordinary day in the Mill River Valley looked like this. Fires lit by 5. Mill bells at 6 and 6:30. Staggered. Village by village. So that a listener on the hills heard them answer each other down the water. Men walking to the brass works with dinner pails. Girls crossing the bridge to the button room. Talking. Their shoes loud on the planks. Farmers' wagons on the Williamsburg road. Children finishing chores before school let them loose to the spring. Wheels turning at Skinnerville, at Haydenville, at Leeds. The river passing from one to the next, doing its work in each place and moving on. The whole valley strung on it like beads on a thread. Progress had a sound in this valley, and the sound was water turning wheels. Above it all, 2 feet from the crest and rising, the reservoir sat in the hills and waited for the rain. The sky had already decided to send. The dam was born in a dry summer. In August of 1864, the Mill River ran thin, the way it ran thin every August, and the wheels along it slowed, and the men who owned the wheels did what they had done in dry Augusts before. They shut down early. They sent hands home. They stood at their office windows and watched a river that was worth nothing to them at exactly the moments they needed it most. William Skinner needed water to run silk. The Haydens needed it to run brass. The mill men of Leeds needed it for buttons and thread. Every one of them had money tied up in machines that only earned when they turned. And every one of them had learned the same arithmetic. A mill on the Mill River earned 11 months of the year, or 10, or 9, depending on what the sky decided. A reservoir in the hills would let them bank the spring floods and spend them in August. Water in the bank, steady wheels. Contracts met, payrolls met, orders shipped on time. It was a reasonable idea. That is worth saying plainly. Because of everything that came later, there was nothing foolish about wanting a reservoir. And the men who wanted it were not fools. They were the most respected men in the county. Joel Hayden had been lieutenant governor of the state. Skinner had built a village with his own name on it and filled it with families who were glad to be there. These were men who paid their hands on time, gave to their churches, and sat on the boards of banks. When they petitioned the legislature in 1865 for a charter to build a reservoir company, the legislature saw no reason to say no, and granted it. The charter made them proprietors together. Each mill would pay a share of the cost according to the water power it used, and each would draw a share of the benefit. What the charter did not do, what no paper anywhere did, was ask a question that hindsight makes obvious. Below the site they had chosen, along 3 miles of narrow valley, lived some 2,500 people. The charter did not mention them. They were not shareholders. The water would run through their villages on its way to the wheels, the way it always had. And nobody thought of them as parties to the matter, least of all the people themselves, most of whom never learned the dam was being built until it was already holding water over their heads. The proprietors hired an engineer to draw the plans. The plans he drew described a serious piece of work, an earthen dam faced with care, and down its center, buried in the earth like a spine, a wall of masonry running the length of it and founded on bedrock, so that water could not find a path through the packed fill. Water is patient. Every man who builds dams knows the whole trade comes down to one commandment. The water must go over the top through your spillway or through your pipe, and never, anywhere, by any path, through or under the body of the dam itself. The masonry wall was there to make the commandment hold. Drawn on paper, keyed into the rock of the hill, it would have made the Williamsburg Dam a dependable thing. Then the plans met the meetings. Nobody in those meetings decided to build a dam that would fail. What they decided, item by item, season by season, was smaller than that, and more ordinary. And that is what makes it worth understanding. They looked at the engineer's figures and found them high. They were businessmen, and the reservoir was a cost, not a product. Every dollar in the dam was a dollar that earned nothing until August. So they did what businessmen do with a high figure. They trimmed it. The contract went out to bids, and it went to men who bid low. And low bids have to come from somewhere. They came out of the dam. The masonry core wall grew thinner on paper than the engineer had drawn it. In places, when the digging got hard, the wall stopped short of bedrock, resting instead on hardpan and gravel. On ground, the builders judged firm enough. The earth that was banked against the wall went in faster than it should have. In bigger lifts, less packed. The grouting was thin. Some of this the proprietors knew. Some of it they never asked about, because they had hired men to handle it. And the men they had hired had every reason to say it was going well. There was a moment, and the record preserves it, when the engineer understood that the thing being built in the hills was no longer quite the thing he had drawn. He objected. His objections went into the same meetings the plans had gone into, and they were weighed the same way, against the figures. And the figures won. He was not dismissed. He was managed. Afterward, he would say that the work had left his hands, and the contractors would say they built what they were paid to build. And the proprietors would say they had relied on the professionals. Every man in the chain had somebody to point to. That is not a flaw in the story. That is the story. The dam was finished in 1866. It had cost the proprietors roughly what a fine house cost a rich man in Boston, set against the mills it protected, against the payrolls and contracts and machinery of 4 villages. It was one of the smallest sums in the whole ledger of the valley, and it was the sum everything else stood on. In the company's books, the entry was clean. A dam, built and paid for, an asset, insurance against the sky. That was one way of writing it down, and it was true. There was another way of writing it down that appeared in no book anywhere. 43 feet of earth, with a short, thin spine, resting partway on gravel, holding 600 million gallons at the top of a 3-mile grade with 4 villages at the bottom. Both entries described the same object. Only one of them would turn out to matter. In October of that year, they closed the gate and let the reservoir begin to fill. It took the better part of a season. The water backed up into the fold of the hills acre by acre, drowning the meadow grass, climbing the trunks of the shoreline trees, finding its level with that lack of hurry that water has, that makes it so easy to trust. A young man named George Cheney would in time take up the post at the gatehouse below, and his family with him, and the sound of the waste pipe would become the sound under their sleep. The clock in the house, as steady and unremarked as their own breathing, 3 miles down the valley. The wheels turned, and the paychecks came, and August stopped being a worry. The water settled in against the dam and began, in the dark, in no hurry at all, to look for its own way down. The dam began to leak the first year it held water. Not in one place, in several. Water showed at the base on the downstream side, seeping up out of the ground, standing in wet patches that never dried. Eva in August, a farmer who pastured land below the dam, saw it and said so. Teamsters hauling on the reservoir road saw it. The men who fished the stream below the gate saw it and talked about it in the villages. The way men talked, over counters and wagon beds. And the talk went down the valley faster than any water did. The proprietors went up to look. This became, over the years, a kind of ritual, and it is worth watching closely, because the whole future of the valley was decided inside it. Word would come down that the dam was showing water. The proprietors would drive up from their mills, good horses, good coats. They would walk the crest and study the wet places below. They would confer, and then they would reach the conclusion they always reached, which was that the leaks were small, that the water ran clear, that all earthen dams weep, and that the sensible course was to patch and watch. They were not lying. This must be understood, or nothing about it makes sense. Each man on that crest believed what he was saying. Clear water truly is a better sign than muddy water. Earthen dams truly do weep, and the dam truly was standing, year after year, through spring floods and hard winters. And every year it stood was another entry in the argument that it would keep standing. The dam's own survival became the case for the dam. Men who would not have accepted that reasoning from a bank or a bridge accepted it here, because the alternative was a figure none of them wanted to look at: the cost of opening the dam and rebuilding its heart. So they patched. When one leak near the east end ran harder than the others, they hauled earth and banked it against the base. A counterweight, a poultice on the skin of a thing whose sickness was under the skin. When complaints reached the county, the commissioners drove out. 3 men with authority over roads and bridges, and no engineer among them, and walked the crest as the proprietors had walked it, and looked at the water as the proprietors had looked at it, and required some repairs. And the repairs were made, and the commissioners declared themselves satisfied. It was the same ritual with different coats. The paper that came out of it said the dam was safe, and the paper went into a drawer in Northampton, and the water kept moving through the dark of the fill, patient, unrecorded, wearing its passages a grain at a time. George Cheney stood at the edge of these inspections, and his position on that crest tells you everything about how the valley was arranged. He knew the dam better than any man alive. He walked it every morning. He knew its wet places by season, knew which seep quickened after rain and which held steady, knew the soft ground at the east end, the way a farmer knows his worst field. When the proprietors came up, he showed them what he had found, and they heard him out, and what he said was received as the report of a hired man, which is what it was. Then the owners conferred among themselves, and decided, and got into their buggies, and drove back down into the valley, to houses that stood on high ground in Williamsburg and Haydenville. Cheney watched them go and then walked back to the gatehouse, where his children were doing their lessons at the kitchen table, 40 rods below the base of the dam, in the one house in Massachusetts that would have no warning at all. He never put that thought into so many words in the company book. But the entries in his own hand grew more frequent in wet seasons, and a man does not write down, again and again, the behavior of a thing he trusts, down in the villages. Meanwhile, the dam had turned into a joke. This happened slowly, and it happened because of the talk. The leaks were common knowledge. The inspections were common knowledge. Every few springs, when the river ran high and the rumors ran with it, somebody's hired man or somebody's cousin would come through a shop door saying the dam had let go, and everyone would go to the windows, and nothing would come down the river but the river. It happened enough times that the warning wore out. The words "the dam is breaking" stopped being an alarm and became a line you said to get a laugh. Mill hands said it to each other on slow afternoons. Boys shouted it at their sisters to watch them jump. In the button room at Leeds, a girl could say it on a rainy Monday and the bench would laugh, because the dam was always breaking and never broke. You could not find a purer measure of the valley's trust, and the trust was not stupidity. It was the only way to live. The people of Williamsburg and Skinnerville and Haydenville and Leeds could not inspect the dam themselves. They could not read engineering plans and would never see them. They lived where the work was, and the work was on the river, and the river came from the hills. And men of standing, men whose names were on their paychecks, assured the county that all was well. Doubting the dam meant doubting the whole arrangement of their lives, and no one can do that every day at breakfast. So the doubt went where doubt goes when it has no work to do. It turned into a joke, and the joke did what jokes do. It made the thing safe to say and impossible to hear. 8 years passed that way. In the 8th spring, the spring of 1874, the rains were long and heavy, and the reservoir rose to the highest mark George Cheney had ever recorded. And the sound of the waste pipe deepened until Elizabeth remarked on it. And up under the crest of the dam, where nobody could see, the water pressed on the thin places with more weight than it had ever carried. On the last night of that story, the night of May 15th, rain fell on the whole watershed. In Williamsburg, the shopkeepers heard it on their roofs and thought about their gardens. In Skinnerville, the boarding house girls heard it and thought about their washing. In Haydenville and Leeds, the mill men heard it and thought, if they thought anything, that the wheels would run strong for a week. at the gatehouse. George Cheney heard it and got up twice in the night to stand at the window. The sound of the pipe was as deep as it could go, somewhere under it, so faint he could not swear to it. He thought he heard the note change, and he stood listening in the dark for a long time and could not be sure, and went back to bed, because a man cannot wake his family every time a sound might have changed, and morning was 3 hours off, and he would walk the dam at first light the way he walked it every day of his life. He wrote nothing that night. The book lay on the desk, closed, with 8 years of readings in it, and the last entry said, "The water stood higher than it had ever stood, and rain was expected, and the seep at the base was running clear." Friday evening, May 15th, came down the valley in rain. It was not a hard rain. It was the settled, patient kind, the kind New England gets in the middle of May, and it fell on a valley that was glad to be done with the week. Saturday was a working day, but a short week's end feeling came with it anyway. Wages in pockets by evening. Sunday behind it. The lamps went on in the villages, one window at a time. And if you had stood on the hills that night, you would have seen the whole 3 miles laid out in small lights along the dark line of the river, and heard nothing but water. In Williamsburg, the shops closed at 8. The storekeeper on the main street counted his drawer and listened to the rain on the roof and thought about his garden, which wanted exactly this. Across the way, the minister's wife trimmed a lamp in the parsonage window. In a house near the upper bridge, a woman named Collins put her children to bed and sat down to her mending, and her husband read the county paper by the stove, and the river ran 20 steps from their door. Loud with spring, the sound so much a part of the house that the family would only have noticed its absence upstream, in the last houses before the ravine, the ones nearest the hill. People banked their fires and wound their clocks and went to bed early, because Saturday started at 5. In Skinnerville, the boarding house windows stayed lit the latest. The mill girls had Saturday to work, but Friday night was for letters. A girl at the long table wrote home to Vermont, told her mother the work was steady and the house was warm, and she was putting by $1 a week. In the room above her, another girl hung washing on lines strung across the ceiling, because nothing would dry outdoors in this weather, and the rain had been at it for days. Down the row, in his big house with the gardens, William Skinner went over accounts in his study. The silk business was good that spring. Orders were strong. The river was strong. And through his window, past his own reflection in the dark glass, stood the mill that held all of it, his name on it, 40 rods from where he sat. In Haydenville, the brass works stood quiet for the night, and the tenements around it were full of supper smells. A caster's wife, on the second floor of a company house, put a plate away for a son working late. 2 doors down, a young couple argued mildly about a stove, the kind of argument that is really about money, and made it up by 9. In the stone house on the hill, the Hayden family's lamps burned above the village the way they always did, high and steady, and below them, along the dark river, the homes of 1,000 people breathed and settled towards sleep. The river ran hard under the bridge by the works. Men crossing home from the tavern heard it and said to each other that the wheels would run strong all week, and that was the only thought anyone in Haydenville gave the water that night. In Leeds, a child was sick. Nothing grave, A spring fever, the kind every house knew. And a mother in one of the riverbank houses decided at bedtime that the girl would stay home from the button room tomorrow and sleep it off. The girl argued, because 60 cents was 60 cents. The mother won, because mothers do. In the boarding houses, the Irish girls and the French girls said their prayers in 2 languages and went to bed 8 to a room. And the river ran under all of it. Past the button works, past the silk mill, carrying rain out of the hills in the dark, and 3 miles up, at the top of everything, the gatehouse lamp burned late. George Cheney sat with the company book open and did not write in it. He had made the evening reading at 6. The water stood where the morning had left it, near the crest, and the rain was still falling on 100 square miles of hillside that all drained to one place. There was nothing new to put down and nothing to be done. The gate was open as far as the gate went. The pipe was carrying all the pipe could carry. Everything after that was arithmetic between the sky and the dam, and no entry in any book would change it. Elizabeth came and stood by him a moment, her hand on his shoulder, and neither of them said anything, and she went up to the children. He stayed a while longer, listening. The sound of the pipe filled the house the way it always filled the house. Deep, round, steady. The clock of the place. He had slept inside that sound for years, and his children had been small inside it, and it had never once meant anything but that the dam was doing its work. A man cannot stand watch all night against a sound that has never harmed him. Near 11, he put out the lamp and went up, and the house went dark, and the rain went on, and the last light in the valley was gone. Everything after this happened in 14 hours. The valley that slept through that rain was a particular place, and it is worth holding still one more moment to see it whole. 2,500 people in 4 villages, strung down 3 miles of narrow ground, mill hands and farmers, owners and boarders, old Yankee families and girls a year off the boat, people who owed each other money, disliked each other's politics, married across village lines, and knew each other's names to a depth that no city ever manages. Every one of them had heard the joke about the dam. Almost none of them had ever seen it. It stood in the high woods where nobody went, holding the rain of that whole wet spring, and its keeper was asleep below it with his family, and its owners were asleep along the river with theirs. Saturday would be fair. The rain was ending by 4 in the morning, moving off east, and behind it, the sky was rinsing itself clean for one of those green and white May mornings the hill towns are made of. The bells would ring at 6. 5 o'clock. The gatehouse. George Cheney woke before his clock, the way he always did, and lay a moment in the gray light. And the first thing his ears went to was the pipe. The sound was there, deep, full, the note of a reservoir at its brim, no different from the sound he had carried into sleep. He dressed and went down and built up the stove, and Elizabeth came down behind him, and the house began its morning around them. And outside the window the hills stood up out of the mist, rinsed clean and green, and the rain was gone. He would walk the dam after breakfast, as he did every day of his life. 5:30. Williamsburg. Fires lit along the main street. The blacksmith opened his doors and raked his forge, and the first smoke stood up straight in the still air. A farmer's wagon came down out of the hill, in early for Saturday trade. Wheels loud on the wet road, and the driver noted the river as he crossed the upper bridge, high and brown and hard against the timbers, and thought nothing of it, because the river was high every May morning of his life. 6 o'clock. The bells, the Williamsburg mill bell went first. Then Skinnerville answered it a mile down. Then the big bell at the Haydenville brass works. Then Leeds, one after another down the water, the sound passing over sleeping and waking houses, over the mist on the river, each village handing the morning to the next. In the boarding houses, the girls were already at breakfast. In the tenements, men took up dinner pails. Children who had chores did chores. Children who did not went back under quilts for the last warm hour while mothers worked around them. And in a riverbank house in Leeds, a girl with a spring fever slept on, as her mother had ruled she would home for the day. Safe from the button room, 6:15. Skinnerville. The frames started. The sound like rain that never lets up rose inside the long mill, and the wheel took the river's weight, and the water that had fallen on the hills a week before went to work making silk. Skinner crossed from his house to the office with his coat open to the fine morning. Orders on his desk. A good Saturday beginning. 6:30. Haydenville. Leeds. Full shifts through the gates. The casting floor at the brass works taking its first heat. At Leeds, the button room filling. Benches of girls. 60 cents a day. 10 hours. Talk in 2 accents over the noise. Below the villages, the river ran on toward Florence, doing its work in each place and moving on. And above the villages, 3 miles up in the high woods, the last morning of the old valley had about 40 minutes left in it. 6:40. The dam. George Cheney came out after breakfast into the washed light and started his walk. East end first, along the crest. The reservoir lying flat and enormous on his left hand, brimful, mist burning off it, and the valley notch on his right, far below, with one thread of chimney smoke standing over where Williamsburg lay hidden in the hills. 11 minutes, if nothing stopped him. Something stopped him. Partway along the crest, he heard the water differently. Not the pipe. The pipe was behind him now, and doing its steady work. This was nearer, lower, a sound coming up through his boots as much as through the air. And he stood still on the crest of the dam, and turned his head, the way a man does, when he cannot yet believe his ears, and wants his eyes to rule on it. Below him, on the downstream face, where the old seep had wept its clear, harmless thread for 8 years. Water was coming out of the base of the dam in a body, not a seep, a flow, wide as a wagon. And, while he watched, it thickened, and the water was not clear. It came out brown, and brown meant earth, and earth meant the water was no longer finding its way through the dam. It was taking the dam with it. He was already moving when the slope changed. He saw it happen. 40 feet down the grassed face of the dam, a piece of the hillside the size of a dooryard slid, all at once. Quiet, almost gentle, the turf folding over itself the way a rug folds. And where it had been, The inside of the dam stood open to the morning. Raw earth, wet, shining, with water running out of it in ropes. For perhaps 3 seconds, George Cheney stood on top of 43 feet of failing earth with 600 million gallons at his back. In the still, bright, bell-rung morning, the only man in Massachusetts who knew. Then he ran for the house. The distance from the crest of the dam to the gatehouse door was about 40 rods, and George Cheney ran it with the sound of the breach growing behind him. There is no good account of what a man thinks in such a run, because the men who make such runs do not remember thinking. What the record preserves is what he did. And what he did was arrive at his own door, shouting, and the shouting was not the shouting of a man who could be doubted. Elizabeth met him in the kitchen. His mother stood up from the table. His father was already reaching for his boots, because his father had spent a lifetime around mill dams and had been waiting for this knock for 8 years without ever saying so. The dam is going. Get up the hill. The gatehouse held 8 people that morning. George, Elizabeth, their 4 children, and his old parents. And the hill behind the house was steep and wet with the week's rain. And the oldest member of the family had 80 years on her, and the youngest had not yet learned to walk. They went up carrying what could be carried, and the thing that could be carried was children. Elizabeth took the baby. George took a child on his arm and his mother by the hand, and his father drove the older children ahead of him up through the wet grass. And nobody carried anything else. No book, no money, no quat, because George Cheney had seen the inside of the dam, and the seeing had burned every other consideration out of him. Partway up the slope, his mother could not keep the pace. And the record is plain about what happened then. He put her on his back and climbed with her. From the height of the hillside, when they stopped, they could see the downstream face. And the family stood together in the morning sun and watched the dam die. The slide George had seen from the crest had grown. Water ran out of the wound in ropes and sheets. Brown, urgent, and as they watched, another piece of the face let go, larger, and the flow doubled, and the sound of it reached them changed, deeper, a grinding under the rush, which was the sound of the dam's own body going down the ravine. The whole structure had not yet failed. That is the detail on which everything below turned. The breach was eating the dam from the downstream side inward, gulp by gulp, and the reservoir was still mostly held. And no man could say whether the collapse would take 2 minutes or 20, whatever the number was. It was the only warning the valley would ever get, and every second of it was being spent on a hillside where nobody lived. 3 miles. 2,500 people. One man who knew. His horse was in the small barn beside the gatehouse. Below them, in the path of whatever was coming, George went back down for it. He threw a bridle on and did not wait for the saddle. Some accounts have him bareback. Some have him snatching the saddle on without girthing it true. And the difference matters to nobody. What matters is that a man rode down the reservoir road ahead of a breaking dam, downhill on wet stone and mud, on a horse that could feel through its feet what was behind it. The road dropped through the ravine alongside the riverbed, under trees still shedding the night's rain, and the pitch of it in places would make a careful man lead his horse on a dry day. Cheney rode it at whatever speed the horse had. Behind and above him, the grinding went on. And there was a moment on that road, remembered afterward, when the sound changed again, rose, took on weight, and he understood that the gulps were getting bigger, that the dam was going faster now, that the arithmetic between the water and the villages had started to run. He passed the first outlying farms above Williamsburg, shouting as he went. Here, the morning showed its teeth, because the first people who heard George Cheney did not run. A man mending a fence looked up at a rider tearing past, hollering about the dam, and the words, "The dam is breaking," landed on 8 years of the same words meaning nothing. And the man stood with his hammer in his hand and watched the rider go and turned the sentence over, deciding. A woman in a dooryard caught half the shout and asked her neighbor what the fool was yelling. The joke of the valley rose up exactly where the joke had lived, in the space between hearing a warning and believing it. And the joke cost lives that morning, and nobody has ever been able to say precisely how many. Some believed. A farm hand above the village heard the rider, looked once at the river, which was running ordinary and brown in its banks, looked once at Cheney's face as he went by, and chose the face over the river. He put his family up the hillside, and they lived. That choice, face over river, was offered to hundreds of people in the next half hour, and the ones who are remembered by name are mostly the ones who chose right. Cheney came down the last pitch into Williamsburg at about 7 o'clock with his horse blown and the village at breakfast. He made for the house of Onslow Spellman, and this stop has been argued over for a century and a half, because Spellman was an officer of the Reservoir Company, and Cheney was the company's hired keeper. And a hired man in 1874 reported to his employers. Spellman came out and heard him, a rider off a foundering horse, saying the dam was breaking, and Spellman did what the proprietors had done on the crest of that dam for 8 years. He doubted it. He questioned Cheney. He wondered aloud whether the keeper had not been frightened by another slide of the bank, the kind they had patched before. He looked, as men will, for the version of the news that did not upend the world. The exchange took minutes. Nobody knows exactly how many, and the not knowing is its own kind of verdict, because minutes were the only currency that mattered anymore. And they were being spent on the doorstep of the one man in Williamsburg, whose position made him slowest to believe. What broke the doubt was not argument. It was a young man standing nearby with a milk wagon, listening. Collins Graves was 27 years old, and everyone on the river knew him by his rounds. He drove milk for his father's farm, village to village, every morning of the working week, down the same 3 miles the water owned. He knew which kitchens took a quart and which took 2, knew the dogs, knew the girls at the boarding house windows, knew the bridges by the sound his wheels made on each one. On the morning of May 16th, he was in Williamsburg with his cans full, near Spellman's place, when a horse came down the hill street half dead under a man he recognized, because everybody knew everybody, and the man was the keeper from the reservoir, and the keeper was saying the dam was gone. Graves did not wait for Spellman's deliberations to finish. There was no speech, no recorded decision, nothing but what he did, which was to turn his team south and put them into a run down the valley road toward Skinnerville and Haydenville. toward every kitchen on his route, with the milk cans hammering in the wagon bed behind him. He drove ahead of the flood to tell the people it was coming. He was one man with a delivery wagon, and for the next 15 minutes, he was the entire warning system of the Mill River Valley. Behind him, Williamsburg had perhaps 10 minutes, and Williamsburg spent them waking up. The doubt broke in the village, the way ice breaks. All at once, after long strain, Cheney's horse, Cheney's face, the first sound out of the hills, and then men were running street to street, pounding doors with the flats of their hands, and the church bell began to swing, hard, off its Sunday rhythm, ringing the way a bell rings when the ringer is hauling in fear. And that sound did what no shout could do. It carried to the houses along the river, to families at breakfast, to old people and to children. And it said in the oldest language the valley had, that this time the words were true. People ran. Some ran to high ground with children under their arms. Some ran upstairs, trusting the house, and the house was the wrong trust. Some ran back inside for a strong box or a coat or a Bible. And the record of that morning is scarred all through with the ones who went back, because the margin was so thin that a coat could cost a life. And some, on the far edges of the village, never heard the bell over the sound of their own stoves and kettles, and were still at their tables when the light in the windows changed. What came down out of the ravine was not recognizable as the river. The survivors reached for comparisons all their lives and never found one that satisfied them. A moving hill, a wall of brush and timber. Hay, one man said. It looked like a great rolling mass of hay, because the front of it was not water at all. It was everything the water had eaten. Trees and stumps, and the road itself, and the gatehouse barn. All of it turning over and over in a front 20 feet high and better than 300 feet wide, coming at the pace of a running horse, and the water behind it pushing 600 million gallons with 43 feet of hill under them. All of it arriving at once. It took the upper bridge and the mills and the houses along the bank, and it did not so much flood them as remove them. The Collins house near the upper bridge, the mother at her mending the night before, was there, and then the front passed, and it was not there. In the time it takes to read this sentence, families on the bank went from breakfast to open water. 57 people died in Williamsburg, more than in any other village on the river, because Williamsburg had the least warning of all. And even so, most of the village lived, and they lived because of a spent horse and a bell rung crazy and neighbors who beat on doors until their hands bled. The flood spent 4 or 5 minutes taking what it took. Then it moved on down the narrowing valley, carrying Williamsburg with it, and it was faster now and heavier. And 1 mile ahead of it, a milk wagon was coming into Skinnerville at a dead run. Graves came down the row shouting to the houses, to the boarding house, to the mill. The dam has broken, to the hills. He did not stop to explain and could not have. Girls came to the boarding house windows and saw the milkman standing in his wagon with his team lathered and knew him. And knowing him was the whole difference. Because a stranger shouting is a question and a neighbor shouting is an order. The mill bell at Skinner's took up the alarm. Families went up the hillsides in their breakfast clothes. Skinner himself got his people moving, and the frames were still turning in the empty mill. Silk running with nobody at it. When the sound arrived from upstream, some in Skinnerville used their minutes well and lived. Some spent them on disbelief, on gathering things, on going to the river to see. And it must be said plainly that going to look was the most natural act in the world. And it killed people, because the front came around the bend faster than what they had pictured, and there was no outrunning it from the bank. Graves did not stay to watch. He was already whipping down the road to Haydenville with the flood behind him, and men who saw him pass swore afterward about the smallness of the gap, that the water was in sight behind the wagon on the straight stretches, that he was racing it in the plain arithmetic sense. A team of horses against a moving hill, and winning by 2 minutes. Then by 1, he came into Haydenville shouting over the noise of the brass works. And the works made his job cruel, because 1,000 pounds of machinery drowns a human voice. But the word jumped anyway, hand to hand through the shops. And the big bell went, and casters walked away from ladles of molten brass, and the village boiled up the hillsides. And at the bridge, a young man named Myron Day, with his own team standing there, took one look at what was coming into the north end of the village and understood that Graves and his blown horses had come to the end of their arithmetic. Day turned his wagon toward Leeds and ran his horses for the last village on the river. Behind him, the flood came into Haydenville carrying 2 villages, and met the brass works, and the brass works, brick, 3 stories, the most solid thing on the Mill River, stood against it for a moment, only a moment. The rider's story runs down the valley at the speed of horses. The village's story stands still, and it has to be told standing still, because that is how the people inside it lived it. In kitchens and dooryards, one house at a time. In Williamsburg, the warning arrived as noise before it arrived as meaning. A woman on the main street heard hoofbeats and a man's voice tearing past, and went on slicing bread, because a shouting rider was somebody's runaway or somebody's quarrel, and the bread wanted slicing. Then the church bell began, and it rang wrong, and the wrongness went through the village like cold water. A bell has a grammar, slow, and even for Sunday, counted strokes for a death. This was fast and ragged, and it did not stop. And every person who heard it stopped what their hands were doing and stood up inside their own lives and listened. In a house above the mill pond, a man named Hill got his family into the road and started them uphill. And his neighbors stood in the doorway asking questions. What broke? Who says? The man could not answer and did not stay. That doorway conversation happened up and down the village in identical words. And the people who asked the fewest questions kept the most of their families. The ones nearest the ravine had the least of everything, least warning, least distance, least choice. They heard it before they saw it. Survivors tried for the rest of their lives to put the sound into words, and the words they reached for were always land words, not water words, like a hill coming, like a freight of timber let loose down a mountain. The ground carried it ahead of the air, so that plates rang in cupboards, while the street outside still looked like Saturday morning, and dogs went mad along the whole length of the village at once, all together, before any human eye had seen a thing. Then the trees at the mouth of the ravine went down, and it came into the open. The front was not water. The people who saw it and lived were exact about this. It was a moving wall of what had been the upper valley. Trunks and roots and planking, the gatehouse barn, the road itself, all of it turning over and over, 20 feet high, wider than the river's whole floodplain. And it did not flow. It advanced. Water ran ahead of it in a low sheet, only inches, sliding through fences and around doorsteps. And that sheet was the last mercy on the river, because it reached some houses seconds before the wall did. And cold water over shoe tops will move a person who has not believed a single word all morning. What the wall struck, it took entire. The grist mill went, and the woolen mill. The houses along the bank did not fill and float the way houses do in the floods people knew. They came apart, or they came off their foundations whole and were folded into the front and became part of what hit the next house. A man watching from the hillside saw a neighbor's home lifted and carried and broken against the bridge, and said afterward that the house went by with the breakfast smoke still coming out of the chimney. On the hillsides, the people of Williamsburg stood in rows and watched the place of their whole lives be edited in front of them. Husbands were on the hill and wives were not. Children had been sent up the slope ahead and parents had gone back for the strongbox. And the ones on the hill watched the ones who went back with a completeness of attention that no one should ever have to spend. A woman held her neighbor's arms and watched her own roof travel. Men counted heads and counted again, and the counting is what broke them. Men who had not made a sound while their barns went under went to their knees over arithmetic. It did not last long. That was the thing the survivors kept saying. In the papers, in letters, for 50 years. 4 minutes. 5. The great weight passed through the village and drew down the river after it, and the water fell almost as fast as it had come, and what had been the west side of Williamsburg was a plain of gravel and mud with 57 of its people gone out of it. The quiet afterward had a texture people could not describe, without apologizing for the description. The river was still loud, but the village had lost its voices. No wheels, no forge, no doors, no bell. Into that quiet came single sounds, each one enormous. A hen somewhere, a man calling one name, waiting, calling it again. Water dripping out of a tree that stood 40 feet from the channel with a dead horse in its branches. In one of the ruined houses on the west side, found days later and talked about for years. A clock had stopped at 20 minutes past 7. It had struck the mud face up, and the mud had stopped its works at the moment Williamsburg ended. And the men who dug it out stood around it in the wreck of somebody's kitchen and did not say very much. The clock knew what no person in the valley had known while it mattered. The exact minute, all morning long. Every terrible thing had happened between the strokes of ordinary time, between 6:40 and 7:20. Breakfast time, chore time. 40 minutes in which the valley's whole account came due. Up the 3 miles of empty riverbed, where the reservoir had been. There was a brown hole in the hills, with a thread of stream finding its old channel through the bottom of it. The dam had lasted 8 years and emptied in less than an hour, and below Williamsburg the flood was not finished. It was larger. It went down the narrowing valley wearing the first village-like armor, and the story has to run now to keep ahead of it. South, 1 mile, to where the milk wagon had already passed, and the frames were still turning in the silk mill. Every village the flood passed through, it kept, that was, the arithmetic, below Williamsburg. And it is the reason the same wall of water grew more deadly as it grew more burdened. At the dam, it had carried trees. At Williamsburg, it took on houses, bridges, mills, wagons, cattle, and the bodies of the drowned. And all of it went into the front, the grinding, revolving face of the thing, so that what came down on Skinnerville was heavier than what had come down on Williamsburg. And what came down on Haydenville was heavier still. The valley narrowed as it dropped. The load grew as it ran. Skinnerville stood next. Skinnerville had something Williamsburg had not had. It had Colin's graves, and the 2 or 3 minutes he had bought. And the difference those minutes made can be counted in the plainest way there is. The village lost 4 people. 4. In the place where the flood arrived stronger than it had arrived anywhere yet. And the number is small for one reason only, which is that most of Skinnerville was already on the hillsides when the water came. They stood up there in their breakfast clothes and watched it take the village apart in order. It came around the upper bend still wearing Williamsburg. Men on the hill saw furniture in the front of it, and sections of roof, and they understood in a way no telling could have made them understand that the thing coming at their homes was made of other people's homes. It struck the row of workers' houses first, and went through them the way a hand goes through standing grain. It struck the boarding house, where an hour before girls had been writing letters and hanging wash, and the boarding house went off its foundation and broke. Then it reached the mill. William Skinner stood on the high ground with his workers around him and watched. The mill had been running when the alarm came, and there had been no time for any orderly shutting down. So the wheel was turning and the frames were spinning their silk in the empty rooms when the flood arrived. And the survivors on the hill could hear the frames right up until the water touched them. The mill resisted longer than the houses had. It was the best built thing in the village. The water opened it, wall by wall, and took the machinery, and took the stock, twine and thread and raw silk, and unwound it all down the valley. And men found silk for weeks afterward, miles below, wound around fence posts and high in the limbs of tree, bright thread in the wreckage. The finest product of the Mill River, delivered by the river to no one. Skinner watched the work of 30 years go into the front of the flood and add to its weight. Whatever he understood in those minutes about water, and about the company he was a proprietor of, and about the dam he had helped decide the price of, he kept off his face. A man beside him said afterward that Skinner looked at the water the whole time and never once looked away, and that nobody near him dared speak to him, for dead was a miracle. And it was a miracle with a milkman's name on it, and Skinnerville knew it that same morning. But the village itself was finished in a completeness that no other place on the river matched. Houses, boarding house, mill, all of it, the entire reason for the place, gone in about 3 minutes. What was left standing at the end of them was Skinner's own house, damaged, alone, above the mud, like a monument to a town that had stopped existing. The flood did not pause there. It was already in Haydenville, and Haydenville was where the valley learned what an industrial flood is. A flood of water drowns. A flood carrying a brass works cuts and crushes. When the front reached the works, it met brick walls, 3 stories high, and the walls held for a moment against a pressure that had flattened everything upstream, and the moment gave men time to get clear who would otherwise have died. And then the walls went, and the whole contents of the largest factory on the river joined the flood. Lathes, boilers, casting flasks, tons of finished brass, iron shafting 40 feet long, all of it went into the mix. And from Haydenville down, the flood was no longer a weight of water and wood. It was armed. The tenements along the river went the way the workers' houses at Skinnerville had gone. But here, the wreckage struck back, machinery scything through buildings, shafting driven through walls like bolts, and people who had reached solid-looking ground were killed by what the water threw. The stone church lost its whole lower story. The company store vanished. The bridge, by the works, the one Myron Day had turned his wagon on minutes earlier, went out whole, and pieces of it were identified that summer 4 miles away, on the hill by his stone house. Joel Hayden's son stood with his people and watched the family's works. The family's village, the source of the family's name in every plumbing catalog in America, become part of the flood. And below the hill, the water was doing something the men watching could hear over everything else. It was grinding. The load in it had grown so heavy. Brass and iron and stone against the ledge of the riverbed, that the flood itself had a voice like a mill, and men said you could feel it in the ground of the hillside, through their boots. A mile of Massachusetts being machined. 27 people died in Haydenville, and the number would have been past counting without the bell of the works and the men who ran the word through the shops. And everyone who lived understood both halves of that sentence. Below the village, the valley made its last narrow reach, and the flood went into it carrying 3 villages, at the peak of its weight and speed, and 1 mile ahead of it, on a road that was beginning to shake. Myron Day was standing up in his wagon whipping his team toward the last houses on the river, where the button room was full, and a girl with a spring fever was asleep in a house on the bank, and the bells of Leeds had not yet begun to ring. Warnings wear down the way everything else wears down, and by the time the alarm reached Leeds, it had traveled 3 miles through 4 pairs of hands. Cheney had carried it to Williamsburg on a dying horse. Graves had carried it to Skinnerville and Haydenville with his team failing under him. Now it belonged to Myron Day, one man on a shaking road with the flood in the valley behind him. And the flood had grown faster as the warning had grown slower. And at Leeds, the 2 lines on that graph came closer to touching than anywhere else on the river. Day came into the north end of the village, standing up in his wagon, shouting himself raw. The people of Leeds had the same 8 years of jokes behind them as everyone else, and less time than anyone else to get past them. Some heard the shouting and went straight up the banks, no question, and lived. Some went to their windows first, and the window was a tax of 10 seconds, and some of them paid it and still lived, and some did not. And at the north edge of the village, the water answered every question anybody still had, because here, for the first time all morning, People could hear the flood before the warning finished passing through. A grinding out of the upper valley that nobody needed explained after the first second of hearing it. The button works stood full. Rows of young women sat at the benches upstairs. Irish girls, French Canadian girls, some of them months in the country. 60 cents a day. And the noise of their own machinery had eaten the first shouting from the road. The word came up the stairs, the way word moves through a mill. Hand to shoulder, mouth to ear. And the room rose all at once, benches scraping, and the girls went down the narrow stairs toward the doors in a crowd. And the doors of the mill opened onto the bank of the river. Because the mill stood over the water. Because the water was the reason the mill existed. Some of them made the high ground, the ones near the front, the ones who did not stop, the ones lucky in where the stairs met the street. They ran up the banks with their aprons on and turned and saw what the ones behind them met. The front came into Leeds carrying 3 villages and the works of 3 villages, timber and machinery and stone, and it struck the button works while the mill was still emptying. There is no gentler way to write the sentence than the way the valley learned it. The building came apart with people inside it and people on its threshold, and the ones on the banks saw it happen. And what they saw was not water taking a building. It was the mill going into the front and becoming part of it, and the front moving on into the village with the mill in its teeth. The silk mill across the river went next, and the bridge between them, and then the houses. Leeds was built close to its water. The bank houses stood almost at the river's edge, kitchen windows over the current, and among them was the house where a mother had ruled the night before that her feverish daughter would stay home from the button room and sleep. All morning that ruling had sat where mothers' rulings sit. Small, domestic, an entry in nobody's ledger. The flood reversed it in 1 minute. Girls who had gone to the benches at 6:30 were on the stairs when the mill went. And the sick girl was in a bank house when the water took the row. And the morning made no distinction anywhere in Leeds between the careful and the careless, the lucky ruling and the unlucky one. 51 people died in the village, and the dead included women from the benches and people from the bank houses both. And for the rest of their lives, the survivors of Leeds carried the special arithmetic of the last village, the knowledge that every minute the warning had lost upstream, in a doorway, in a question, in a doubted keeper, had been spent here, out of their families. There were rescues in Leeds that entered the valley's permanent memory. A man who went back down the bank 3 times for other people's children. 2 girls who held a third between them in the water until the 3 of them fetched up against a standing tree and were taken out an hour later. Alive, silent, wound in silk thread the flood had carried from Skinnerville. A woman pulled through a window by neighbors as the house folded, who asked after her cat every day for a week and never once mentioned the house. Below Leeds, the valley opened, the hills stepped back, the grade flattened toward Florence and the meadows, and the flood came out of the last narrow reach and began, for the first time in an hour, to lose. It spread, spreading. It slowed, slowing. It dropped what it carried, and the meadows above Florence became the flood's own ledger. Acre after acre of everything it had taken, laid down roughly in the order taken. Timber and brass and furniture, and animals and the dead, 2 and 3 deep in places. Silk thread over all of it. Bright in the mud, at Florence the water was still strong enough to wreck the lower story of a mill and drown machinery. And men there fought it at the doors, with the alarm bells going. But it killed almost no one below Leeds. It had spent itself against 4 villages, and the wide land finished it. And by mid-morning, what passed Northampton was only a brown river running very high, carrying broken boards. And the people who lined the bridges to watch it did not yet know what the boards were. An hour. Dam to meadows. 14 hours since the last lamp had gone out in the valley. 139 people. And upstream, in the sudden and total quiet, the survivors were coming down off the hillsides. Walk it again. That was the thing the living did on the 16th of May. All of them, without arranging it. They came down off the hills and began to walk the valley, up it or down it, looking for their people. And the road they walked was the same 3 miles. This story has walked twice already. Once as a working valley, once as a race. Walk it a 3rd time now. At noon, going down, the way the neighbors went. Start at the dam, because a man was standing there. George Cheney had come back up the reservoir road on somebody's borrowed horse, and he stood at the east end of what he had kept for 8 years and looked at it. The dam was a notch, a brown gap in the hills with raw sides, and through the bottom of it ran the Mill River. Small, ordinary, finding the stones of its old bed as if the 8 years had not happened. The 100 acres of water were simply gone. And the goneness was the hardest thing to look at. A lake-sized absence with birds already crossing it. The gatehouse stood untouched below the ruin, which was its own strange sentence. And from where Cheney stood, the sound of the place was wrong. In the deepest way, a sound can be wrong. The pipe was silent. The clock of his house, the note under 8 years of his family's sleep, had stopped. And the silence where it had been was so loud that he said afterward he could not stay near it, and rode back down. Below the dam, the ravine was scoured to ledge. Trees gone, road gone, the very soil gone. 3/4 of a mile of Massachusetts, plain down to bare rock, shining wet in the sun. Then Williamsburg, where the counting had already begun. The west side was gravel. Men stood on it, trying to agree where the streets had been, and could not. And these were men who had lived on those streets. The church stood, and the bell that had saved the village hung silent in it. And below the church, the survivors moved across the mud, flats in lines, calling. That was the sound of the whole valley at noon, and every survivor's account returns to it. Names, called and called, spaced by listening. Now and then an answer came. Someone found alive under timber, in a tree, on a scrap of high ground, and the shout that went up then carried the length of the village. Mostly, there was no answer, and the callers moved on, and called again. A mile down, Skinnerville answered no one, because Skinnerville was not there. The mill was gone to its foundations. The boarding house, the workers' rows, gone. Skinner's house stood alone and broken above the plain of mud, and the people on the road walked past the place in a silence different from the silence anywhere else. Because in the other villages you looked at wreckage, and here you looked at absence, nothing to search, very little, even to recognize. A village of 200 people had become a smooth brown field with silk in the trees at its edges, and the man whose name it carried stood in front of his ruined house all that afternoon, receiving his workers one by one as they came to find out whether they still had lives there. And to each of them he said what he could, and what he could say was not yet much. Haydenville was the opposite, and in its way worse. Everything was there, and nothing was whole. The brassworks lay open to the sky, its walls thrown down, its floors hanging, machinery bedded in mud, the length of the village. The wreckage was iron and brick, sharp, heavy, terrible to search, and it had to be searched. And the men of the village went into it with bars and their hands. They worked in their church clothes and their work clothes, and whatever they had fled in. By noon, the first of the dead of Haydenville had been carried up and laid in the shade, and the men laying them down were their foremen and their neighbors, and in 2 cases their brothers. And the work went on all day and did not finish. Leeds, at the bottom of the narrow miles, was where the valley's grief was most crowded. 51, gone from a village of hundreds, whole benches of girls from the button room among them. And it was at Leeds that the searchers coming down from above met the searchers working up from Florence, and the 2 lines of calling voices joined, and the valley was one single search from end to end. And below Leeds, in the meadows, lay everything. The people of Florence and Northampton walked out into acres of the upper valley spread across their hayfields. They found furniture, and they gathered it into piles for owners who might come. They found strong boxes and Bibles, and a mantel clock stopped a few minutes past 7, and they set them together carefully, like things at an auction of ghosts. And they found the dead of 4 villages, delivered miles from their doors. And this was the fact of the day that no one in the meadows ever managed to say plainly, that the flood had not only killed its people but scattered them, so that Williamsburg's dead lay in Northampton grass, and mothers would search 3 towns' worth of riverbank before they could stop. By evening, word had gone out over the wires from the Northampton telegraph office, and the wider world had begun to learn the names Mill River and Williamsburg. The messages moving out over the lines that night were the start of something new, and the valley would feel the whole weight of it within a day. The reporters, the relief trains, the crowds, but the 16th itself belonged to the valley alone. When the light went, the searching had to stop, and the survivors gathered into the houses that stood 20 and 30 to a house, and the lamps came on in the villages that had them. Fewer lights than the night before, and every one of them crowded, and the sound of the valley that night was low voices, and weeping behind wall, and the river. The river ran all night in its old bed, shallow, quick, harmless, the size it had been before 1866, and the people lying awake beside it had lost, along with everything else, the oldest sound they knew. The Mill River they had slept against all their lives was gone. This was a stranger, running in the dark over clean stones, and they lay listening to it, learning it, because morning was coming, and the calling would begin again at first light. And there were still names on the lists, with no answer beside them. A village has buildings for its living and buildings for its dead, and the proportions are settled by centuries of ordinary time. The flood overturned them in a morning. By Sunday the 17th, the dead were coming in faster than any custom could receive them. And the valley did what people do when custom fails. It improvised with what stood. In Williamsburg, the town hall took them. In Haydenville, it was the church. In Leeds, a schoolroom. Benches pushed to the walls. And in Florence and Northampton, the dead from the meadows were carried into whatever public rooms were nearest and largest. Doors that had opened all their existence for meetings and sermons and spelling lessons opened now for wagons that came slowly up from the riverbed with men walking bareheaded beside them. Inside, the work was identification, and it was work that fell to neighbors, because there was no one else it could fall to. The dead were laid in rows, and the mud had made them anonymous. And this was the labor nobody who did it ever fully described. Women of the villages came with water and cloths and washed the faces of the drowned so that families could know them. It was done gently, and it was done by lamplight into the night. And some of the women doing it found their own people under the cloth. And the accounts agree that when this happened, the woman was led outside and sat with a while, and that in nearly every case she came back in and took up the next cloth, because the room was full and the families were waiting at the doors. At the doors, lists. Paper went up on the church doors and the hall doors, written in whatever hand was steadiest that hour. Names of the found, names of the missing. The lists were the valley's whole information system. And people traveled from building to building, village to village, reading doors. And the reading had a terrible grammar to it. A name moving from one list to the other meant hope ended and grief begun. A name absent from both meant another day of walking the riverbanks. Husbands read for wives. Fathers came at dawn before the searching, and again at dusk after it. A man from Leeds walked to Northampton and back every day for 4 days, 8 miles each way, reading doors. And on the 4th day found the name he was looking for on the found list at Florence. And the men there had to catch him when his legs went. The coffins gave out on the 1st day, which no town's arithmetic had ever had reason to anticipate. The valley's carpenters worked through the nights, and lumber came up from Northampton by wagon, and still the supply ran behind the need, and undertakers from 6 towns away drove in unasked. On Tuesday, mourners in Williamsburg stood in a burying ground with 57 graves needed, and dug what could be dug. And the sound of that week in the villages, under everything, was hammering, and the church bells going in the slow counted strokes, over and over, one family's count, and then the next family's count, until the counting itself became the valley's weather. And through all of it, the living organized themselves with a speed that no one directed and everyone afterward remembered. The houses that stood took in the people whose houses had not, without any question being put or answered. Farm families from the hill towns came down with wagons of food, of clothing, of bedding, unasked, on the first morning, and kept coming. Kitchens in the surviving houses cooked continuously, and women who had washed the dead by night boiled kettles for the living by day. A shopkeeper in Williamsburg, whose store had survived on high ground, opened his shelves to the village and stopped keeping accounts. And when someone asked him about the accounts, he said the accounts had been in the other half of town, which was one of the only recorded jokes of that week. And the men who heard it laughed the way you laugh at a funeral. Briefly, gratefully, close to the other thing. The valley had been 4 villages. Grief consolidated it. Men from Haydenville dug in Leeds. Skinnerville's homeless slept in Williamsburg. The searching parties mixed until nobody thought about where a man was from. And this, too, went into the valley's permanent memory. That the flood had erased the lines between the villages. In the same hour, it erased the villages. And that for 1 week, the 3 miles functioned as a single town with a single purpose. And no one who lived through that week ever spoke of it without a kind of wonder underneath the sorrow. By the following Saturday, the burying was mostly done. 139. The lists said now, and the number had stopped moving. It broke down in ways the valley would spend years absorbing. 57 at Williamsburg, 4 at Skinnerville, 27 at Haydenville, 51 at Leeds. Among them were whole households, parents and children together. Among them were 43 children. Among them were girls from the button-room benches who had been in America less than a year, and were buried by a village that had known them a few months, and mourned by families across an ocean who would learn it all from a letter. The church in Haydenville was scrubbed and aired and given back to Sundays. The schoolroom in Leeds got its benches back in rows. The buildings resumed their old work, and could do it, because buildings forget. The doors were another matter. For years afterward, people of the valley coming to those doors would pause. Some of them, an old half-second, the body remembering paper that the eyes had read there, and then go in. The nation arrived on Monday, and it arrived by rail. The telegraph had done its work on Saturday night, and the Sunday papers in Boston and New York had carried the first fragmentary accounts, and by Monday morning, the story stood on front pages across the country under stacked headlines, and the trains coming up the Connecticut Valley began delivering the modern world to the Mill River. Reporters first, from the Boston dailies and the New York dailies and the illustrated weeklies. Men with notebooks who fanned out across the mud, asking survivors to say it all again. Behind them came the artists, sketching the ruined brassworks and the plain where Skinnerville had been for engravings that would put the valley's grief on parlor tables in San Francisco. Behind the artists came the crowds. This is the part of the story that sits strangest with modern readers. And it should not, because it is the most familiar part. On the first Sunday after the flood, and for weeks of Sundays after, excursion trains ran to Northampton loaded with sightseers, and the roads up the valley filled with hired carriages, and thousands of strangers walked the 3 miles to look. They picnicked within sight of the searching parties. They carried off souvenirs, brick from the works, silk from the trees, until men of the villages began posting themselves at the worst places. Some visitors gave money, some gawked and left. The papers scolded the spectacle, even as their own coverage swelled it, and the people of the valley bore it with what patience they had. And a Williamsburg man was quoted, saying, The second flood was worse dressed than the first, but stayed longer. The money, though, the money was the other face of the same national attention. And it was extraordinary. Relief committees formed in Northampton within 2 days. Zoba men, publishing accounts of every dollar. Boston sent thousands. New York sent thousands. Mill towns across New England, towns that lived under their own dams, on their own rivers, sent what they could with letters that did not need explaining. Churches took collections from Maine to Ohio. Within weeks, the fund stood at over $100,000, a sum larger than the dam had cost. And the committee set about the work no committee had ever done in quite this way in America: feeding, clothing, and rehousing the population of 4 villages while it decided, case by case, family by family, what a lost house was worth, what a lost breadwinner was worth, what a lost mill job was worth. It was charity, and it was needed, and every dollar of it was voluntary. Nothing anywhere required anyone to pay the valley anything. That fact sat quietly under the whole relief effort, mostly unremarked that summer, and it will return in this story, because the difference between charity and justice was about to become the valley's last lesson. While the country looked at the valley, the mill owners looked at their books, and the valley watched them do it. Everything now depended on decisions made in offices. The mills were the valley. Rebuilding them meant the villages would live. Not rebuilding meant the flood would keep taking things for years. And here, the paths split. And the split taught the valley something about itself that the flood alone had not. The Haydens announced, almost at once, that the brass works would be rebuilt on the same ground. Larger, whatever else moved them. And grief, and pride, and insurance all had their shares. The effect in Haydenville was that men who had buried neighbors on Tuesday were clearing brick on Thursday for wages. And the village understood that it would continue to exist. The mills at Leeds, likewise, in time. Williamsburg's smaller works came back part way, slowly, and the village came back with them. Smaller too. William Skinner did his arithmetic differently. He had lost more than any of them. His mill, his village, very nearly his fortune, and he was courted like a prize, because towns understood what his payroll meant. The city of Holyoke, 20 miles south, was building itself around canals off the Connecticut River. Water power on a scale the Mill River had never dreamed of. Engineered, inspected, insured. Holyoke offered him land and power on terms a ruined man could accept. He weighed the narrow valley that had made him against the wide one that wanted him. He chose Holyoke. The decision was rational in every visible particular, and the proof of its rationality is that Skinner's mills in Holyoke would thrive for generations, and his name would go on to buildings and institutions across Massachusetts. But its meaning in the valley was final, in a way no other single event after the flood was. The machinery that could be salvaged went south by wagon and rail. The workers followed their work, family by family. That summer and fall, Skinnerville was never rebuilt. The village that one man's will had raised out of a meadow went back to being a meadow. And it happened twice. Once in 3 minutes by water, and once across a season by ledger. And of the two erasures, it was the second that could never be argued with. By midsummer, the valley had settled into its new shape. 3 villages rebuilding. 1 village dissolving. A relief committee paying out. Tourists thinning as the novelty wore. The papers moving on to fresher matters. One question had not moved on. It hung over the 3 miles all summer. Present in every conversation that touched the dam, which was every conversation. The reporters had asked it the first Monday, standing in the mud. The survivors asked it at the burying grounds and after. It was the simplest question in the valley, and the only one with no answer posted on any door. The dam had killed 139 people. Somebody had built it. The law was going to have to say who. And in July, in Northampton, under a coroner's writ, the saying began. The law came to the valley in the plainest form the law had. There was no grand tribunal for such a thing in 1874. No federal agency. No board of engineers with subpoena power. What Massachusetts had was the coroner's inquest, an instrument older than the state itself, built for a single question. A death had occurred. What caused it? In June, the coroner of Hampshire County impaneled a jury of inquest at Northampton. Ordinary men, farmers and tradesmen, and a manufacturer or two, and set them to answer that question for 139 deaths at once. And the answering took the better part of the summer. The hearings pulled the whole history of the dam out of the drawers where it had been sleeping. The engineer came, and the contractors came, and the proprietors came, and the county commissioners came, and George Cheney came, and one by one they sat down before the jury and swore. And for the first time since the Reservoir Company had been chartered 9 years earlier, every man in the chain of its decisions had to describe his link in public, with the others listening, in a county where the burying grounds were still raw. The testimony of the working men went in first and stood plainest, Cheney told the morning. The walk, the sound, the brown water, the slide of the face, the family up the hill, his mother on his back. The ride down? He told it without decoration, and the room was silent for it. And then he told the other thing. The 8 years, the leaks he had reported, the inspections he had watched from the edge of the patchings. He was asked whether he had considered the dam safe, and the record preserves the shape of his answer, which was that he had trusted the men who built it, because they knew what he did not, and that he had reported what he saw, because that was his post. And the jury looked at a man who had lived under the dam with his children for years on exactly that division of labor, and moved on. Collins Graves testified, and Myron Day, and survivors from each village, fixing times, fixing warnings, fixing the width of the margin between the shouting and the water. Spellman was examined about the doorstep, about the minutes spent doubting, and his answers were the answers of an honest man describing a failure he would carry for life. That the words had been cried wolf too many years, that he had wanted to be sure, and the jury, who had all heard the same joke themselves for the same 8 years, wrote it down and did not press him hard, because pressing him meant pressing the whole county. Then the dam itself went on trial, and the room learned how the thing had actually been built. The engineer produced his plans, and the plans became the summer's central exhibit, because held against the testimony of the men who had done the digging and the filling. They described a different structure from the one that had stood in the hills. The core wall, drawn on paper, ran deep to bedrock. The core wall, sworn to by workmen, stopped short of it along whole sections, footed on hardpan, on gravel, on judgment. The masonry drawn on paper had a thickness. The masonry described under oath was thinner and grouted lean, and the earth against it had gone in wet and fast. Witness by witness, the gap between the drawn dam and the built dam opened in front of the jury, and into that gap, plainly visible to every man in the room, fell 4 village. The question became how the gap had happened, and here the summer produced its lasting spectacle, which was the sight of respectable men pointing at each other under oath. The engineer testified that his design had been sound and his supervision curtailed, that the proprietors had trimmed his figures and taken the work out of his effective control, that he had objected in the proper quarters. The contractors testified that they had built what the contract specified for the price the contract paid, no less, and that if the specification was thin, the thinness had been purchased upstream of them. The proprietors testified that they were manufacturers, not engineers, that they had hired professional men precisely because dams were beyond their competence, and that they had relied in good faith on the assurances of those they paid. The county commissioners, who had inspected the dam and pronounced it sufficient, testified that they were roadmen by experience, that the statute gave them the duty of inspection but no engineer to inspect with, and that they had seen what laymen see: grass, water, a standing wall. Every man's account was, in its own frame, substantially true. That was the terrible discovery of the Northampton summer, and the jurymen, being practical men, could be watched arriving at it. They had convened expecting to find the flaw, the lie, the culpable hand, and what the testimony assembled in front of them instead was a machine of divided responsibility, in which each part had performed plausibly, and the whole had killed 139 people. The proprietors had economized, as proprietors do. The contractors had bid low, as contractors do. The engineer had deferred, as employed men do. The commissioners had signed, as untrained inspectors do. The dam had done the only thing such a dam could eventually do. Late in the hearings, a juryman put to one of the proprietors a question that the newspapers carried down to Boston, and it was the question of the whole matter: whether, knowing what he now knew, he would have paid the difference. The difference meaning the cost of the dam as drawn against the cost of the dam as built, a few thousands of dollars, the price of the thin places. The witness answered that no man would refuse it with hindsight, and the juryman, a farmer, is recorded to have said nothing further, and the silence after the answer was, men wrote later, the loudest thing heard in Northampton that summer. The inquest closed its testimony in July. The jury retired to write what it had found, and the valley waited. And while it waited, it rebuilt, hammering going up and down the 3 miles, all through the hot weather. And everyone understood that whatever paper came out of Northampton would be the last official word the dead would ever get. The finding came in late summer, and it did not flinch. The jury of inquest having heard the whole chain, condemned the whole chain. The verdict found the dam defective in plan and defective in construction. It found the proprietors culpable for building cheap, for accepting a structure they had been warned about, for keeping their insurance in patchwork and assurance. It named the engineer's design as inadequate to its duty. It named the contractor's work as unfaithful to even that design. It named the county commissioners as having inspected without competence and approved without warrant. Almost no man who had touched the dam between 1865 and the morning of May 16th stood outside the verdict's language. As a piece of plain civic truth-telling, the document was complete, and the papers printed it entire, and the valley read it, and it said what the valley already knew. Then came the second half of the lesson, which was what the truth was worth. A coroner's verdict in Massachusetts carried no sentence. It was a finding, not a judgment. For punishment, there would have to be indictments, and the indictments never came. No grand jury proceeded against the proprietors, or the engineer, or the contractors, or the commissioners. The law of the day measured criminal negligence by standards that gentlemen of standing, acting through hired professionals, reliant in stated good faith upon one another, did not meet. Each man's pointing hand, which the inquest had exposed as the anatomy of the disaster, served in the law's eyes as the anatomy of his defense. Responsibility had been divided so finely in the building that no single share of it was large enough to prosecute. 139 people were dead. An official document said plainly who was to blame, and no one was charged with anything. And that was the end of the criminal question forever. The civil question ended the same way, only quieter. The families of the dead and the owners of the drowned houses had, on paper, the right to sue the reservoir company. In practice, the company was the mill, and the mills were the valley's only wages, and a widow's suit would be brought against the payroll her surviving sons now depended on, before juries of the same county. Through years of appeals the mill owners could afford, and she could not. A few claims were made. They settled small or died procedurally. The great fact, staring at the valley from behind all the legal language, was that not $1 ever moved from the men who had built the dam to the people the dam had killed as a matter of liability. What moved was charity, the relief fund, freely given by strangers, paid out its 100,000 and more with diligence and was praised on all sides, and the praise was deserved. And it changed nothing about the principle. The valley's dead were an act of men, and they were paid for like an act of God. Set the two columns side by side, because the valley did, for the rest of its life. In one column, the difference between the dam as drawn and the dam as built, a few $1,000s. The price of masonry carried to bedrock, of grout mixed full, of earth rammed in thin lifts. In the other column, 139 names, 4 villages, and by the reckonings made afterward, property losses above $1 million, 10 times the cost of the whole dam done right. No court ever joined those columns. They were joined only in the inquest's unenforceable paragraphs, and in the heads of the people who lived along the 3 miles, where they stayed joined permanently. A private ledger, closed and kept, and yet The summer's paper was not nothing, and the story owes the record this last turn. The verdict of Northampton could punish no one, but it could be read, and it was read in the one place where reading becomes law. The legislature of Massachusetts took up the matter in its next session. With the inquest's findings on the desks and the illustrated weekly's engravings still fresh in every member's parlor. And in 1875, the state enacted what the dam had proved was missing. Reservoir dams would be subject to inspection by competent engineers under state authority. Plans would be examined before water ever stood behind new works. The private wall above the public valley would no longer be private in the old, absolute sense. It was among the first laws of its kind in the country, and other states, in time, followed it, and the line of such statutes runs forward from that session through every dam safety office that exists in America today. The valley noticed the law and understood its arithmetic precisely, because it was the valley's own arithmetic inverted. The statute would inspect every dam except the one that mattered to them, which no longer existed. It would protect every valley except theirs, which had already paid what Massachusetts bought in 1875. It bought with the 139, and the purchase was real, and the price was them. No one was punished. Something was learned. The valley had to hold both of those sentences at once, and it held them the way people hold such things, not in speeches, but in habits, in how a Williamsburg man paused on a rebuilt bridge, in how the joke about the dam was never made again by anyone, anywhere on the river, for a generation, in how mothers along the 3 miles, for years, on heavy rainy nights in May, would lie awake listening to the water, and know exactly what they were listening for, and know that it could not come again, and listen anyway. The official story was over. The paper was filed at Northampton. What remained was the valley itself, and the long, quiet work of living in it. And that is where this story goes now, up the river one last time, into the year after. The year after a disaster has no anniversary in it, and that is the hardest thing about it. It is only days, one after another, each one asking the same ordinary things of people who are no longer ordinary. The valley answered with work. By fall, the brass works at Haydenville was rising again on its old foundations, and rising larger. New brick going up over the scoured ground, and the sound of it? Hammers and hoisting and men calling measurements ran down the river, all through the cold weather. The Haydens hired every man who came, and men came who had dug their own kin out of the old works, and they laid brick where they had lifted timbers, and nobody talked about that part, and everybody knew it. When the new machinery started up in the spring, the village turned out to hear it. There are worse monuments than a payroll. Haydenville chose to live, and the choosing was made of shifts and wages, morning after morning, until the choosing had become a village again. Leeds mended slower, the way a place mends when its dead were young. The mills came back, the buttonwork and the silk, and the benches filled again, and the new girls learned the work from the girls who had run up the banks. And between the two kinds of girls, there was a difference that never needed naming. Houses went up along the river, but not as close along it as before. Nobody passed an ordinance about that. The village simply built a few rods higher, house by house, each family reaching the same conclusion privately. And in 50 years, the shape of Leeds itself would be a record of the flood, legible to anyone who knew what the empty ground nearest the water meant. Williamsburg came back smaller, and knew it would. The west side stayed thin for years. Gravel lots where streets had run, and the village carried the largest share of the dead and carried it the longest. But the church stood, and the school filled, and the farmers still came down out of the hills on Saturdays, because trade is loyal to a crossroads. And slowly, the main street knit itself back around the gap the way skin knits around a scar. Closed, but different. And everyone born there afterward grew up knowing exactly where the difference was. And a mile below Williamsburg, nothing came back at all. Grass took Skinnerville the first summer. By the second, a stranger driving the valley road would have seen a wide green meadow with a broken house above it, and asked what the house was doing there alone. And any child in the valley could have told him. The Skinner machinery was in Holyoke, and the Skinner families were in Holyoke, and the mill whistle that had woken 200 people on the Mill River now woke them beside a canal 20 miles south, once or twice a summer. Some of them came back, a wagon of them on a Sunday, and walked the meadow, and stood where their doors had been, working it out from the lilac bushes, which had survived, because lilacs do, blooming in rows along the front paths of houses that were not there. Then they drove back to their new lives, which were good lives, in a city with inspected water. The valley did not blame Skinner, or said it did not. His arithmetic had been honest. It was only that the valley now understood, in a way it had not before the flood, that it had always lived inside other men's arithmetic, and that a village could be a line in it, and the line could be moved. All that year, the mud gave things back. Men plowing the meadows below, Leeds turned up spoons, and daguerreotypes and brass fittings stamped Haydenville. Children found things after every rain. What was found was carried to the store at Williamsburg or the church at Haydenville and laid out on tables, and people came and looked through the tables the way they had once read the doors, and claimed what was theirs. And the claiming went on for years. A woman from Leeds was handed her mother's sewing box by a Florence farmer who had kept it dry in his barn all winter, waiting to learn whose it was. And she thanked him. And the record of small decencies like that one runs through the whole year like the silk through the trees. The clock from the west side of Williamsburg was never fixed. The family that owned it set it on a shelf in their rebuilt house with the hands where the mud had stopped them. 7:20, and visitors who asked were told the truth. And after a while, nobody asked, because everybody knew. It kept its own kind of time, which was the valley's other time. The permanent morning underneath all the ordinary mornings. And it turned out that a broken clock was the only fitting one, because what it marked had not moved and was not going to. George Cheney stayed at the gatehouse a while, keeper of a gap in the hills. There was work at first, the company's affairs to close, the ruin to watch, and then there was less. And then there was none. The family moved down into the living valley in time, and George took other work, and men pointed him out to strangers for the rest of his life. That is Cheney. that rode ahead of it. He bore the pointing patiently. Once a year, roughly, some newspaper man would find him and ask for the morning again, and he would give it. Plainly, the walk, the sound, the slide, his mother on his back, and every telling ended the same way, with the reporter asking how it felt, and George Cheney saying he had been too busy to feel, and both of them knowing that was the answer he could live beside, and letting it stand. Elizabeth said, years later, that for a long time he woke at 5 wherever they lived, and lay still, listening for the pipe. In April of 1875, the snow came off the hills fast, and the Mill River filled its banks. And the valley listened. It could not help listening. The rains that spring were long, the way they had been long the spring before. And the river ran high and brown past the rebuilt bridges, loud in the night. And all down the 3 miles people lay awake inside the sound, testing it against the sound in their memory, and getting up, some of them, to stand at windows in the dark. There was nothing above them now. The reservoir was a meadow in the hills with a stream through it. Every soul on the river knew that. They stood at the windows anyway, because knowing is one kind of truth, and listening is another, and the body keeps its own counsel about which to trust. By morning, the river was only the river, and the valley went to work. That was the year the new law took hold, and the engineers began going out from Boston to walk the tops of other people's dams. They went with authority no inspector had carried before, into the hills above other valleys, and they measured core walls and probed spillways and condemned what wanted condemning. And somewhere in Massachusetts that year, and every year after, a wall was thickened or a pond drawn down because of a paragraph written out of Northampton. No plaque anywhere says so. The families who were never drowned by the dams that never failed have no way to know they are in this story. And that is the way the arithmetic of prevention always runs. The valley had bought them their ignorance, and the price is on the stones at Williamsburg and Haydenville and Leeds. 43 of them cut small. For the children, 15 years passed, and then the country learned a new name. In the spring of 1889, above a Pennsylvania steel city called Johnstown, an earthen dam holding a private lake gave way after long rain, and the flood it loosed killed more than 2,000 people in an afternoon. It was the Mill River written again, larger, every clause of it, the cheapened structure, the years of leaks, the doubted warnings, the club of gentlemen on high ground, the verdicts without punishment. The news reached the Mill River Valley the way it reached everywhere, by wire and paper, and the people of the 3 miles read it with a grief that belonged partly to Pennsylvania and partly to themselves, because they alone in America read it without surprise. They had been the lesson, and the lesson had not carried far enough. And now there was a bigger lesson, and the country would remember Johnstown forever and forget the Mill River almost entirely. And the valley understood that too. Memory follows size. They had only been first. But forgetting is a thing that happens in the country at large. It does not happen on the ground. On the ground, the valley remembered in the grain of itself. In the houses built those few rods higher, In the bridges rebuilt, with their stones set deeper than any road commissioner required. In the pause a Williamsburg man made on the upper bridge. All his life. So brief that strangers never saw it. In the meadow at Skinnerville. Mown for hay every summer by farmers who never plowed it deep. In the way the valley's mothers taught their children to swim young, without ever quite saying why. In the stopped clock on its shelf. In 57 graves, in one burying ground with the same date cut into them, where every decoration day, for 2 generations, someone left flowers on all of them. The kin on their own, and the village on the rest. And it remembered in a habit of the ear. The people who had lived through the 16th of May listened to water differently for the rest of their lives. And they could not teach the difference and did not try. But their children grew up beside parents who went still for half a second when the river changed its note in the night. And stillness, like that, is a language, and children learn it. Long after the last survivor was gone, people along the Mill River would say of themselves, without knowing quite where the saying came from, that theirs was a valley that kept an ear on its water. That was the inheritance. Not fear. Attention. The oldest sound in the valley had once changed its voice on a bright Saturday morning. And one man had known the change for what it was. And 3 miles of people were alive at the end of that morning because of the knowing, and dead all along it because the knowing came so late. George Cheney had learned the water's voice from a gatehouse where it filled his family's sleep. It had taken him 8 years. It took the valley 1 hour, and the valley never forgot it, and never again lived beside any water it had not learned. The river is still there. It comes down out of the hills the same way. Through Williamsburg, through the meadow, through Haydenville and Leeds. Smaller than its story. Quick and clear over the stones. In a dry August you can wade it. In a wet May it fills the valley with its old sound, running past the villages in the dark. And the villages sleep beside it. And the sound is only a river. And it took 139 people to make that sentence true. And to keep it true, somewhere in Massachusetts. An engineer will walk the top of a dam tomorrow morning. He will not know their name. The water does not need him to. It only needs him to look